If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Yo, man. What's been good?
Just been busy, man. School, and more school.
Yeah, I am not jealous. I'm glad I'm done school, man.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm a professional student, and even just like teaching. So I've been doing like some teaching in the classes and curriculum stuff, but it's been fun, and you know it keeps the wheels turning. Of course, in light of all this COVID stuff, it's kept me definitely prayerful, but you know so far so good.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The Mises Institute actually launched a master's program, and there's like tempting in me to be like, maybe I want to do that. But I mean, in general, when you say the teaching side of you, I love learning. I just hate school. I love reading. I love learning. I love podcasts, right? Because I want to engage and learn. But, the rigor and that side of it, and partly just like with full-time job and all those other things and kids, like I can't even fathom. Like I got a buddy of mine doing his MBA on like weekends and like, man, mad respects to anyone who goes back to school in essence, because like I just couldn't do it.
Yeah, no, and after once I'm done, I'm gonna go back and do some more. So yeah, so it is what it is, man. But yeah, so back to the topic at hand.
Or to the topic at hand.
Yeah, to the topic at hand. Well, I know it's kind of mimicking a Snoop line, but yeah, back to the topic at hand. Or is it lecture? Correct, send me and let me know if it was lecture topic. But anyways, so today we're going to be talking about some indigenous issues. And hopefully this won't be the last of these kind of episodes, because especially as Joel, I feel as like Canadians, this is one of those topics that gets kind of swept under the rug, and there's a lump under the rug, and then we keep tripping over it, and then we hit our elbow on the coffee table and we're like, oh, that stupid lump. But
yeah, like the problem keeps popping itself up, and then we notice it, and then we deal with it for 5 minutes. Like,
yeah, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating because when you look at like politically, especially when I started watching the Canadian political debates, and everybody would definitely pay the Indigenous issue lip service, but that's about it. And everybody across the board always agreed that technically all you really do for Indigenous people is give them lip service. You give them a land acknowledgement and you keep it moving. And especially, looking at social justice, I think this is a social justice issue, and really looking at, well, what can be done versus just giving a land acknowledgement. Like, let's really look at ways that can actually help them and look at the things, the barriers that are there that's preventing them from progress. Yeah,
I mean, it's funny, as you were saying that, I feel like one of the problems is we try to find one size fits all solutions, right? To some extent, I think this came up a little bit when we were doing the Canada's racist policies episode, right? Because the Indian Act was sort of that part of this conversation because of the 6 classes of Canadian citizens. And I probably made the point at the time that, because I know I've made it before, I think on the show, on the podcast, that to some extent, the way we do the Land Act, or the land recognition, as you put it, through the Indian Act, we essentially have all these mini socialist utopia experiments, because nobody owns the land, nobody owns anything. They have a collective ownership. And when I might have been that episode, it might have actually been when we were talking about foreign aid to some extent, and I don't know why, but we were talking about the Wet'suwet'en tribe with respect to the pipeline on one of the recent episodes, and to some extent, there's a divide between what sometimes the leaders of the, say, tribe for simplicity want, and what maybe the civilians, if you want to call it that, want. And so to some extent the land recognition maintains the political power. And so my point about a one size fits all solution is that, maybe allowing for unique options, right? Okay, this tribe wants to try this, go ahead. Right, this section of land, we're going to try this. And instead of just one size fits all, here's a new solution. It's sort of the market competition idea. Let's experiment, let things happen, see which creates more progress, which creates regression. So. I mean, and I don't know if you know how bad some of the things are. Like I had a relative who did their first teaching, teachers college, sort of post teachers college first teaching on a reserve in Saskatchewan. So basically Northern Ontario border. And like, it was like heartbreaking to hear the kind of thing that goes on. 13-year-old kids showing up to class drunk, right? Like half the kids not coming every day because they're just getting drunk. And so, to your point, like, we as a culture, society sort of like, don't even think about this as a problem. Don't worry about it until, they're trying to build a pipeline and they're protesting. And then it becomes, as you said, the bump we trip over, or the thing, it's this issue starts to poke its head through. And now we have a conversation about it. We pay it lip service and then don't talk about it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what's going to launch our conversation is an article from the Fraser Institute by a young lady named Ravina Baines. And the article is called Property Rights for All Canadians, the First Nations Issue Forgotten by All Federal Political Parties. And in it, she says, consider this fact. In Canada today, there are 3 groups of people who cannot legally own property: children, the mentally incompetent, and First Nations people who live on a reserve. That's right. First Nations people in Canada who choose to live on a reserve are grouped in the same category as children. So how is this possible? Well, under the Indian Act, First Nations people do not own their own land. Instead, it's held for them by the government. Because of this policy, First Nations people who currently live on reserve do not enjoy the same property rights as every other Canadian. On-reserve members are unable to earn equity on their home, use it as collateral to borrow money, sell their land to whomever they choose, or bequest their wealth to their children. So, I mean, the first question, I'd like to clarify, ask is, what is the Indian Act? The Indian Act is one of those things you remember learning about in middle school, and then basically it's all a blur from there. All you know is that things went really bad.
I mean, if that, how many people really remember it, right? You're sort of like you said, to some extent, I would argue we, at least from what I remember, it was like we paid it lip service. Like you sort of knew about it. That was it, right? Like the teacher sort of checked the box. Oh, okay, I taught this part of the curriculum, done. And I just say that because I think I've learned more either through, for example, like, this is so super random, but like working at Sport Check, I remember someone being like, oh, here's my card that gets me exempt from HST. And I'm like, what? What is this? How do I get one of those? Right? Like, so my point is like, the experience of what I learned in school, there's an Indian Act and, it was a way to resolve conflict. Done. You know what I mean? Like there's zero sort of comprehension. And plus part of my point is like, are we teaching at the appropriate age that like, we're actually informing kids in a manner that potentially could lead to change? And I would say probably not, because generally speaking, we're going to teach these things in a way that we don't want change. We want to say, well, whatever the government's, for the most part, government schooling is sort of like the government did the best they could. Here's what it is. And nothing to talk about. right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
not taught in a controversial way because, yeah, it is what it is. But anyways.
Yeah. So the Indian Act is a Canadian federal law that governs in matters pertaining to the Indian status, which we're going to talk about later, bans, and Indian reserves. Throughout history, it has been highly invasive and paternalistic, as it authorizes the Canadian federal government to regulate and administer in the affairs and day-to-day lives of registered Indians and reserve communities. The authority has ranged from overarching political control, such as imposing governing structures on Aboriginal communities in the form of band councils, to control over the rights of Indians to practice their culture and traditions. So the Indian Act has also enabled the government to determine the land base of these groups in the form of reserves, and even to define who qualifies as Indian in the form of Indian status. So,
It sounds like the government's deeply involved in what exactly these things are.
Yeah. Yeah, but I guess the simple solution, or we would just say, is okay, well, why not, like, just looking at it face value, why not just let them be, give them their property? But then that poses a question of what the basis of our conversation will be about, is like, what is a property right? Like, how do you know something belongs to somebody? Because the government is kind of positioning themselves to be gracious and not misrepresenting the government. Like, the government is positioning themselves in a way that, well, they're insinuating that this is their land. This is government land. This isn't Aboriginal land. Mm-hmm. And so, just to be fair, because part of it, usually, when you get into conversations about Indigenous issues, it's usually, we have to kind of say the politically correct things, or not ask certain questions. But the question, I want to ask is, okay, well, before we get into whose land is this, the land is yours. The land is yours. Anyways, what is a property right?
Yeah, that's it's such a deep question, and I mean, realistically, it's not. I think many people take that question for granted, right? And I mean, even let's say the current cultural affinity for socialism, right? I would suggest that majority of pro-socialist people don't even know, okay, well, what is property rights, and what would it mean to remove property rights, right? What would it mean if there was no such thing as landowners? Yeah,
okay, but first, how would you define what a property right is?
Well, yeah, so I just wanted to say, I just was trying to contextualize that it's an important question that I think we don't even talk about. For me, I think there's lots of philosophical stuff that you can get into on this question, but I think for me, the way that I don't want to say talk about it for the layman, but if I'm having a conversation with somebody who's never really engaged it, I think the starting point is, think about yourself. Right? Think about you, like, you are the primary property of you, right? Like, whatever, like, my point is to say, let's start there when it comes to property rights, i.e. the idea of what's called self-ownership, right? That, to me, that's the starting place of the conversation, because it allows you to identify some pretty clear things, and, I don't want to call it elephant in the room, but sort of the clear counterexample is the idea of slavery, right? Slavery is the removal of self-ownership. And so, I mean, I don't know, what is your take on that? I mean, I know we were going to go somewhere with it, but in terms of self-ownership and property rights, do you think that's a fair place to start? Do you think maybe that's even too nuanced? I think
what I would start with, how does one transfer their individual rights to a piece of property? So when we're looking at the indigenous issue, and when I mean indigenous, I'm not even saying specifically Canada, but just indigenous, Aboriginal, meaning from the original people of a land. I think we have to ask, okay, well, the land that they're on, the resources, is it theirs? So does any human being own a natural resource? And I would say no. No human being owns a natural resource because the human being didn't create it.
So I mean, what you're saying is in the natural state of things, nobody owns it. Now,
like nobody can own the ocean. Nobody owns the ocean.
I mean, like the ocean arguably is slightly more complicated, but I think you could apply the same thing to a forest.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. Not ocean to forest, but yes, in general, like natural resources.
The reason I wanted to use a forest because it's a little bit easier to sort of hash out, what it looks like. There are people who, especially in the libertarian community, would say the reason why we have a pollution problem is because of nobody owns the water, or nobody owns ocean or portions of ocean. And I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to hash out the nuance there. If someone's listener goes, well, what about polluting? Yeah, okay. There's a long conversation there, so don't throw darts at me. But let's go to the forest example. Probably the simplest claim would be the idea of, before I get there, the funny thing I wanted to say is we would say, oh, nobody owns the natural resources, but then how do we define the government as owning it? It's sort of a oxymoron, or maybe oxymoron is not the right word, but to me, there's a level of like, well, no individual owns it, but okay, but the collective representation of the people own it. It's kind of like, what does that even mean? Like, to me, there's a bit of a logical contradiction there, or you're sort of just taking a step without making a sound argument. So, I think in general, if we're talking about the creation of property rights, there's this idea of what's called homesteading. And I think the simplest way of looking at it, or terminology that's ever used, is to say someone would begin to own the land when they homestead it, and homesteading requires mixing your labor with the land. So the example would be you walk into the woods, you find a forest, and let's call it uninhabited for argument's sake. And then you cut down all the trees and start building a house on it. And realistically, this is how Canada settled. This is, we essentially had people coming from European countries, and the government basically said, you get to own the land if you build on it.
Yeah. But can I give some pushback to that, the idea, the concept, just to nuance it, because I've been doing some reading on John Locke and Lockean theory. John Locke being 18th century political scientist / philosopher. You guys might remember learning about him in university or last year of high school, but Lockean theory is arguing that just because a person lives on the land doesn't mean they own it, because they didn't create the land. But what Locke argues is that one can transfer their rights to property by mixing their labor with the natural resource and creating something, i.e. creating a house. So if you created the house from the natural resource, then you own the house, but not the property. In general, like his body of work was, like most economists would, he's arguing that, the broader picture is, human beings, their responsibility is to use the resources most efficiently to promote, to help advance mankind. So that's what John Locke would argue, is that, and I would probably agree with him on that, that you would mix your labor with the natural resource and then create something new. So you're creating something new versus like, okay, well, I'm just bathing in this lake here, so I own the lake. I'm using these branches to keep me warm, so I'm using the tree. Well, no, you're not. You're just using up the resource.
And for the listener, you got to put this in like an 18th century context where, let's say, most land is uninhabited. Today, the means to which you would do that would be generally not uninhabited land. But if you think of your salary and wealth as stored labor, because essentially you've accumulated income from your labor or entrepreneurial. So you've created, I would argue, that's stored labor that you've then traded for property. So I just wanted to, make sure that the listener is remembering the context to the Lockean argument. And yes. I think there's an easy way to sort of transition it to today where...
Hold on. But before we get there, I wanted to, I will put this in the show notes. So there's an article on fee. And the article was called "The Moral Foundations of Property Rights," and so in it, there's this interesting blurb in it, and maybe this will be helpful for the listeners to just think through what these options are when it comes to property rights and so forth, and especially original property rights. So it says, original claims to property are sometimes defended with a finder-keeper approach. According to this argument, the discoverer of, say, an oil field is its rightful owner. But if this approach applies to oil fields, it should also apply to the discovery of a continent, planet, or galaxy. Merely being the first to observe something or putting up the capital that leads to a discovery seems to be insufficient grounds for full private ownership. Other claims to property are based on first occupancy, but this argument, the first person to occupy a piece of land as its rightful owner, but merely being the first to set foot on, say, Mars, doesn't seem to create a moral claim to the entire planet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've sort of laid out a really good example of how property rights is a complicated issue. In terms of what is it? How do you adjudicate? How do you determine?
I'm finding it pretty straightforward, man.
Well, but I mean, in this regard, right? Like, well, then how does someone start to claim, the example of the oil field, right? Because like the Mars example, to some extent, okay, yeah, I can see how, let's call it the first owner or the first person to step foot doesn't work. Okay, take the oil field as an example. Well, generally speaking, we're talking like you discover an oil deposit. Well, what happens if two people, let's say 2 kilometers away, find the same oil deposit because it's connected? And so they've both dug wells, they've both mixed their labor, they both discovered it, and they've actually discovered the same oil reserve.
Well, yeah, but I would say, but if they discovered the same oil reserve on separate lands, then they're just pooling from the same resource, no?
Well, you're right, but the argument could be like, well, potentially, do they have to share it 50%? Is it based on who pulls it out of the ground first, right? Like, the point is, to some extent, that the reason I thought oil was really good, because it came up in your example, is that there's still sort of aspects to this that aren't as straightforward once we sort of lay the foundations. And I think it's important just to point out that this is, something that I would argue, and if you look at, North America, Western culture, property rights are so fundamental. And the reason being is, look at it in the respect to, the idea of, storing up your labor in, like, so I built a house on my property, but if all of a sudden it's like, I don't actually own it, and all of a sudden someone could come along and just take that away from me, I would have no incentive to actually build the house.
Right.
So this is where the argument against socialism really comes into play, is that the reason why the West or Western culture has been so successful is because of entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial culture, where people keep the fruits of their entrepreneurial activities, right? And so when I take the risk to mix my labor and put, time and effort into something, if it produces a significant gain, I reap that gain. Whereas, take the contrast with an employee, the employee doesn't bear any risk. The employee agrees to a contract. I show up, I commit my time to you, and you're going to commit money to me. That employee doesn't have any other risk profile. Their risk is this the right job for me? Is this the wrong job for me? Should I be doing a different job for my career? Is this enough money? Like they're different risk calculations. It's not the risk of, is this a good decision or a bad decision? If I make the wrong decision, the employee doesn't bear the consequences, other than, the employer may no longer be able to work with them, but there's, the legal ramifications there. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is there's a question about, okay, property rights. Maybe the listener might be like, okay, I realize this is a complicated issue, but that doesn't mean I want to throw complicated. It away. Well, so when I say complicated, I think of the fact that you're going to have disputes that need to be resolved.
Okay, so stop. Let's resolve it. Let's resolve it right now. Whose land is it? Is it Aboriginal land or government land?
Okay, so are you asking what do we do moving forward, or what are you asking me? How is it right now?
No, I'm asking you like originally down to the root, in origin.
Well, so this is where I think,
of course, me and you agree. Sorry, I shouldn't set you up like that, because me and you both agree that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Me and you both agree that nobody owns the land. So I'm assuming that the only way we'd know, the only argument we can really come up with how is basically how the land, what's the best way to use the land. And I guess I'm already kind of answering the question that when the British Empire was colonizing, their attempt was to, of course, expand their kingdom, and do that by, using the resources to expand their kingdom. And I'm sure, when they came to Canada and they saw the Indigenous people and the way they were using the resources, they're like, we can use it better. And so I would say, of course, by force.
Yes.
Yeah, by force. And I would say, when you look at, many treaties in the Indian Act and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the British Empire says, okay, you know what? We are going to acknowledge your land rights. And I think this is important to note, that in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Empire says, okay, we're going to acknowledge Aboriginal land rights. We're going to section off everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. I know we don't have a map, and people are like, Appalachian Mountains? What is he talking about? It's a pretty, basically everything west of the Appalachian Mountains would belong to the Indigenous people, and the American colonizers were kept out and kicked out if they were living on reserve. So now the point I'm making is, now when the British inserts themselves and they're saying, okay, look, we're going to set aside land for you. Now we are the ones who are going to mediate the dealings of how property will be sold and so forth. So we want this land. We want X land. We want this piece of plot of land because, of course, there's great resources, great minerals to advance their cause. So it's okay, look, we're going to compensate you for this, right? So we're going to compensate you for this. We see this in the Robinson Treaty in 1850. We're going to compensate you for this. Here you go. Now, of course, we'll get down later on down the road on what the implications of that were. But the point I'm making is that as the British Empire coming in, they are taking a more, I mean, of course, I don't want to misrepresent any side. I want to try to not straw man any side and speak graciously. But I think that the British Empire was trying to, of course, they thought their way was the best way. And they thought their way of handling the resources was the best way. So I want to quote from the great philosopher Beanie Siegel, circa way back 1997, and the great Beanie Siegel says, it's either you get down or you get laid down. Those are your options. All right. It's either you get down or you get laid down. So here's what we're going to give you. All right. Cool. All right. Now give us this land, and now
it's a peace treaty.
So basically, what the British Empire is saying, okay, well, we can use this plot of land better than you, so move over.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's an important thing to point out here. Property rights are a solution to essentially violence, right? Because property rights create a means to adjudicate disputes.
Right. Okay, good.
As opposed to by force.
Right.
Right now, you're sort of laying out the foundation of, and here's where I would say, arguably, they didn't do it well. And that is the concept of, okay, we want this land, we're going to compensate you for it. The part of the predicament is you're trying to set up property rights in a place that doesn't have property rights already. And so, you're, again, let's take the concept of homesteading or other, the indigenous tribe might say, well, we are located everywhere, right? We just move. We're a mobile people. And so we spent 2 years there 20 years ago. So we own that land too. And so you end up with my point is to say that, or we buried our ancestors there for 50 years, but now we bury them over here. And like, so the point is that I'm just trying to lay out is that they might be, the indigenous might be claiming, or the Aboriginals might be claiming they own the land based on their concepts.
Yes.
And to some extent, you end up with violent conflict, and they're trying to create a resolution to the violent conflict through, the Appalachian Mountains, treaty. You can argue that wasn't good. You could argue that it wasn't fair. But that's not, I don't think that's a fair presentation, because at the same time, you're forgetting that if no treaty was signed, potentially it would have been just warfare till one side was dead and one side was alive.
Yeah, well, you get laid down.
Hindsight's 2020, right? My point is to say we don't know what the best option was. Potentially this option actually was the thing that resulted in the least amount of death, and
that the nice neighborhood you live in Mississauga. Right, so that's the kicker, because we sit here today. We do our land acknowledgements, and if I was an indigenous person, I'd be so offended. I'd be so pissed off every time they did a land acknowledgement. Like, I'd be so angry, because I'd be like, okay, so, like, but I still don't have my land. Like, come on, land versus an apology. Let's weigh the two. Like, I'd be like Indigenous Lives Matter. I'd be so pissed.
Indigenous Lives Matter. It's good. It's a tough, I mean, I don't want to stay on this too long, but I think, it is a tough issue, right? Because we're trying to look back in history, and it's so easy to just take the moral high ground and be like, well, I wouldn't have done that. And it's like, come on, how would you have resolved this problem? Oh, I would have never traveled there to, colonize. Yeah. Okay. Like,
yeah, but you know what? But even like, Joel, if you look at the argument, like from survival, like we don't live in a context where we're, striving for survival. So back then, if you really think about like whatever kingdom or tribe, whatever, the main goal is for your people to survive and to expand. And so, yeah, you're going to be, disrespectfully ambitious. Like, if you know how to use a resource better than these people here, and it's a matter of survival, right? Because like we said, like, yeah, like look how everything turned out. Look where we live. It's terrible. It's terrible that, Indigenous people got the short end of the stick. But, for the rest of Canadians who live in these nice, big, comfy houses and fancy this and bike paths, bike lanes. I hate bike lanes. You got bike lanes.
Hey, I don't mind them through the middle of the woods, bro. Those are great.
Yeah, I hate bike lane. But anyways, but it really sucks to see how not everybody's gonna end up happy and of course, like you said, hindsight's 2020. We're going to move forward into the present and look at these things hindsight. So one way we can transition to that is, so I mentioned the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and that is in our Charter of Rights right now. And that's what Indigenous people point to as their rights, because it was acknowledged by the British Empire, by the Crown. Right. So there's continuity there historically. When we look at, there was a point where the British were acknowledging their rights, and it's in our charter right now. But when we look at the dealings between Indigenous people and the Crown, meaning the government, well, actually, we still have the Crown as a symbolic figure. But anyways, but when we look at the dealings now, we look at the impact of the Indian Act, mainly in the area of status, non-status. So,
well, and just before we get there, I think it's good to point out that, like, we sort of already said this, but I want to really reiterate it. We basically said the government owns this land, right? These people don't own the land, right? So if this, let's say, any given, Indigenous band or tribe.
Okay, sorry, Joel. I don't want to put you in the hot seat, but why don't they own the land? Why would you say they don't own the land?
Okay, so you said that in the Indian Act, the government holds the land for them. So if I'm understanding it correctly, that means they don't have the ability to sell the land. They don't have the ability to reap. If they've deemed the land to be really valuable and they wanted to sell it for the resource and move, or let's say they wanted to sell 50% of the land that theirs recognized as theirs. They don't have that ability, which means they don't have any property right other than they can live on it, right? It's almost like they have a free rental agreement with the landowner. And so I thought it was important to point out that in reality, when we say, there's land, what was the term? Land recognition? Is that the right term? When there's land recognition, what that is saying, here's land that we're not going to do anything with because there's people already settled on it who we agree to leave alone. But they're not allowed to sell it, in essence. Now, I'm sure if they try, if they want, they could make an agreement with the government maybe, but they couldn't go and do things on their own independently. So this is, and why that's important is going back to, well, they don't really own the land. So they don't, of course, these are essentially, that's why I keep using the term. They're like little mini socialist experiments, right? Because they don't own the land. They have a joint custody ownership that nobody can really custodian the land in and of themselves. And so why do you see these problems with, like, some of the problems are absolutely insane. Like, they'll build a house on the land for the Indigenous people, and they'll start pulling the walls apart to use for firewood.
Okay, but why is that?
Because they don't own the land. They don't own the property. There's this.
And so there's no incentive to invest
and maintain
in
it, and they couldn't turn around and sell it, and they can't, there's no pride and ownership, and all the things that, like, we look at the behavior and go, this makes no sense. Yeah, because we're imputing, if I was there under my circumstances, I wouldn't behave that way. But we're failing to recognize the incentives and the infrastructure. So I just thought it was important, after we had all that conversation about property rights, to properly understand, really, they don't have property rights. They have very different version of something like property rights that we enjoy.
Yeah, and I guess the alternative, like, in my mind, like, let's say the government, tomorrow says, okay, you know what, we're going to give them back their land. But with that comes the withdrawal of any support, any retribution.
You'd have to transition.
Right, so it's a total, like, okay, pardon?
You'd have to do it transitionally. You can't just, like, because you're sort of asking them to change the way of life without. Okay, because this conversation is leaning towards reparations, and that's why, like, I'm sitting here and I'm telling you. Well, I look at the welfare cliff.
Is there a gradual? Pardon?
I look at the welfare cliff as a
okay. Well,
concern.
yeah, but you just said a gradual, and now you're talking about welfare
no, because
cliff.
the whole problem with the welfare cliff is that it's not gradual, right? So what happens is with welfare cliff, and I think we've talked about it way back. But I think we were using the example of Chicago, where, like, if I start making an extra 10 grand, I lose 20 grand in benefits. That's why it's called the welfare cliff, because the idea being like, okay, let's just remove the support and give them the property. But they're so accustomed to the system, the way it is, that they're not prepared. And so this is where the idea of transitional, right? You don't want to now, I'm not saying that to remove all the benefits and then give them property wouldn't work. There's just an aspect of are you going to make a bad situation worse in the short term that makes you abandon the project altogether?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm just saying the extreme would be they get back their land and so forth, but if it would result in the government saying, okay, yeah, you guys are totally cut off from any kind of support, if that's the case, how many people would say, okay, fine, let's do that? Because what I was saying, just from the argument of from what Black people and reparations, well, there is no limit to reparations. There isn't. Right? It's just going to be an ongoing handing out of payments.
And let's contextualize that properly. And so I think correct me if I'm wrong, the argument that you're sort of basing that statement on is that if we classify reparations based on the inequality that we see today, that potentially in the future, there's still inequality, therefore more reparations are needed. In the future, there's still more inequality.
No. I'm not even going that far. You're going way farther than I am. I'm just saying that money can't atone for those sins, and so it will forever be something that will always be paid out. That's all I'm saying. Because of the severity of what you're trying to give reparations for, really no dollar figure can truly match it. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we have the issue of the Indian Act with the status, non-status, and so for those of you who aren't clear on what that exactly means, is that. So you have the Indigenous people as a whole, the population, which is 4.9% of the Canadian population. Compare that to 3.5. Black people are 3.5% of the Canadian population. So with that 4.9%, you have a group of people. You have the Inuit, who mainly live in the Northwest Territories. And they are non-status, meaning that that the government acknowledges their race, and there's supports that come with being acknowledged status, legal status by the government. Those people who are non-status do not get any support from the government. Of course, they still see themselves as their own ethnicity, but that they just choose to operate apart from the government. So you have the Inuit,
but they also had to stick to reserve locations, right? Whereas status,
yes,
which doesn't. That's why I bring that up, just because the Inuit doesn't surprise me because of where they live. That it's just
that's what I was gonna say. Yeah, so for the Inuit. Right, so we're the Inuit, because of where they live in the Northwest Territories, which is predominantly cold. They're out there and they're living their lives, and they're non-status. And then you have the Métis, who is a mixed race of Indigenous and French, and they, because they're a biracial people, the argument is they don't have any land, right? Because they come after.
Oh, I see.
Right. So then they fall into the non-status, and now you have the First Nations group, right? So the First Nations is those who will be recognized as status Indians. Now within the First Nations group, you have those who choose to be status and those who choose to be non-status. Now we had our our research consultant and Joel, our research consultant, Stefan, the Econ Don, and Joel crunched some numbers from the 2016 census. Do you want to explain some of those numbers and maybe explain those numbers and the graphs and the stats that you guys did?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple, I mean, there's sort of two, just to contextualize, let's say, a bit of the numbers that we laid out.
Okay, sorry, Joel, can I ask you just off the bat, what percentage of First Nations people status versus non-status?
So, in essence, so there's, let's just, I'll walk through it quickly. So we really, like, from this link, which I'll put in the show notes page, it's I think the page has actually been archived, but not a big deal. Because First Nations are, let's say, as you said, in general, their status, i.e. on reserve, there's a bit better ability to look at, like, who's on reserve, status, who's not on reserve, non-status. Whereas in the other groups, because of, as you already laid out, the status, non-status doesn't quite apply. The on reserve, off reserve really only applies to First Nations. So First Nations, first off, they make up 60% of total Indigenous, roughly. I'm rounding up. So that's of the 1.6 or 1.7 million Canadians that are Indigenous, of the Indigenous population, just under 1 million are First Nations. And then 35% of them live on reserve and 65% live off reserve. So actually twice as many people live off reserve as on reserve within the First Nations population, which I found fascinating. And to me, that's something I would want to know more, right? I want to know, what is the cause, right? And what has the trend been there? That kind of stood out to me. In terms of other stats, the other thing, the Inuit make up basically only 4% of the 1.7 million, which works out to like 65,000. And then, is it, I don't want to say it wrong, but Métis?
Métis. Yes, Métis. But also, I wanted to note, Joel, not to cut you off, but these stats were also pulled from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So this was a report that the government put millions of dollars in to pull these numbers. And so we looked at those, and we looked at 2016 census. But sorry, go ahead about the Métis.
Yeah, so they make up so the 35%. So basically, I said 60%, 35%, and about 4%. Again, there's it doesn't quite add up to 100 because I was rounding off numbers, but this is something, if you're interested in First Nations, Indigenous people, Aboriginal populations, I think this report would have some interesting information. So it was 2016 census. It was released 2017 or October of 2017. So again, I'll put in the show notes page for anyone who's curious. It's not just stats. I mean, obviously they translate the stats into, verbiage, but they've got a lot of numbers in here because it is mostly sort of census based.
I think the question that I found that I would ask, that I find fascinating is, that I didn't know. And it's kind of weird because, you hear it and you grow and you go to school and you hear, okay, status and this status and non-status and this and this and that. But, I guess for me as a Black person, I've always looked at it as this. I've always interpreted the Indigenous situation as this. I'm a Black person. And usually the narrative I get is that we really suck. We suck at everything. And so you grow up thinking, oh man, we suck. So it is what it is. And then you start looking at the Indigenous people as a Black person. And then you're just like, oh, could it be that there's a people group worse than us? And so it kind of got me asking the question. I'm like, so I just find it really fascinating. How could they be worse than us? Or maybe we're worse. And so now I'm trying to weigh who's more terrible, or who's got the shorter end of the stick. And so the thing that stuck out to me was status. And I'm like, wait a minute, as a Black person, what would status look like? That would look like me going to the government to get them to recognize me as a Black person. And give you money. And treat me a certain way. Treat me different. Different than other citizens, as to be like a super citizen kind of thing, or something like that, where you're kind of like, okay, I found the whole concept in my mind offensive, that I would go to somebody to qualify me. I'm black. I don't need somebody to affirm me as black. I don't need, and I said this before, I don't need the government to affirm me as black. I don't need Black Lives Matter to affirm me as black. I don't need Pan-Africanism to affirm me as black. I'm black. I wake up in the morning. It is what it is. You just go about your business, right? So for me as a black person, I find the idea ridiculous that I would go to the government to get them to affirm me. So I would ask the listeners, just in your own skin, like how do you feel about status? Would you opt to look for status to be white, status to be brown, status to be whatever, versus non-status? Like, okay, no, I'm cool. I don't need your help. I'm going to be over here. So I noticed that there's a group that's saying, okay, you know what? I'm not going to fight over the land. I don't want the government help. I'm just going to, do my own thing here. I love my culture. I love my people. I just don't need the government to affirm that. But Joel, let me ask you, what's your whole 2 cents on this whole thing?
Well, my first thought is like, I'm just sort of drawing the contrast that like, I don't affiliate myself with any people group other than Christian. And I don't mean that to sound like in any particular way, but like just trying to think back to like my childhood, like, I really only was like, okay, Christian was sort of the only category, Christian and hockey player. I mean, obviously maybe Canadian, but in the sense of like, if I'm different than someone else, right? It was, within the school system, it's like, I didn't really put people in those boxes of like, oh, that's this group of people or this group of people. I mean, I think the one exception would be like, if there was a really thick accent that I couldn't understand, that'd probably be the only exception. Where, I don't want to say other them, but like, I see them like, because I have difficulty communicating, right? Whereas like every other, race or whatnot who's, let's say, integrated into Canadian, like second generation immigrant, let's say. And I only say that just because I was like, as you were talking about it, sort of like thinking of being black as, I don't know, would you say a failure? Is that what you said? Or
yeah.
Like,
yeah, just in general. Yeah.
Like I didn't
like
really,
this negative stigma.
Yeah. Like I'm just sort of contrasting that with the idea that like, I didn't really have, a group that I would have said, oh, we are this, about, and like I said hockey, but that's just because it's the sport I played. If I played soccer, potentially would have been soccer, right? Like it was just, that's a subgroup that I existed in. And then the other one being Christian. So anyways, I thought it was an interesting, and contrast. And I mean, I can think of reasons why, but also I would think, is that not, culturally, society wise, I think we would want to strive towards not having, the child version of Darnell think of himself in that way, right? In the next generation, and so on, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's just, similarly with regards to the Indigenous people, like, when I talked about my, the stories I heard about living on reserve and being a teacher, I can only imagine, if you go to class drunk or stay home and get drunk as a 13, 14, sometimes 10-year-olds. Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine there's thinking the same things, but 10 times worse. And if we want to strive towards, let's say every child sort of having a positive outlook on themselves, how much more work do we have to do in the Indigenous community to change things? There's this movie, and I'm rattled. I can't remember it, but it was about a guy who went out to, I want to say Yellowknife, I don't know for sure, but he basically brought lacrosse to the community, to the Indigenous community, and it transformed the community because he was having problems with kids showing, and again, it was a kid who this guy who accepted a job as a teacher. It was an unreal movie. It was based on a true story, based on telling a story about suicide and oh man, I'm rattled. I can't remember the movie, but it was it only came out a couple of years ago. But it was honestly, I'm sure I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes page. But it was really an uplifting movie because suicide in those communities is outstandingly bad. I think it's called the Grizzlies. Yes, I think that's it. Yeah. Group of Inuit students, small Arctic town. Yeah. So, it's a movie I definitely recommend. Obviously it's not going to be the, amazing budget, but anyways, it's a really, really good story. My 2 cents on this is that this is an issue that I think for most of us is just so foreign to our lives that it's hard to even comprehend what the problem is. Let alone what are the solutions. I don't want to, and I think my point, I said at the beginning, I think, as we talked through the idea that they don't truly have property rights, the idea I said at the beginning, let's start trying micro experiments. To some extent, what does the community think they need, right? What is, and try to empower them. I mean, my answer, to some extent, we have universal basic income there through status Indians and financial support. It's clearly not working. Let's stop trying to do the same thing and expect a different result. And I think, individual type solutions is how we sort of think through, is there a need to maintain the concept of a reserve? Is there a need to have these? I don't know the answer. And I think people who try to proclaim that they know the answer on a separate group of people is sort of one of the biggest problems we have in society today. I think allowing people to make decisions for themselves that you're empowering them is how we start to see change occur, as opposed to let's try this top-down solution and hope that it has a different result than we've been having for the last 100 years in these communities. What about you? What's your 2 cents?
My 2 cents is I think it's important for us to grasp the concept that the government is an institution. Therefore, it cannot honor its vows. It cannot keep its promises. And I think that's where this whole mess starts, is that we're expecting an institution which doesn't have eyes, doesn't have a heart, to hold a vow, to hold a promise, to keep a promise. The government can't do that. They just got to do what's, politically expedient. So I'm not to be a Debbie Downer and be pessimistic, but yeah, you can't expect the government to keep vows. And so in light of that, I would say that God gives us our human rights and our identity, not the government. So we see these rights being played out in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13 to 15. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, pointing to the sacredness of human life and the human being, and God making us in his image, his image bearers. And then the other point is that, we love our neighbors, we love ourselves, Mark 12:31. And then my last point is that God gives us property rights, not the government. So when we look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God made all natural resources. So he has the right to tell us how to use it. And so he gave all men a command in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, the cultural mandate, to use those resources to promote human flourishing. When we look at the new heavens and the new earth, no one will have their own individual piece of land, but God will reward people with the property according to how they stewarded the gift he gave them. Hebrews 10:34. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. What do you guys think? Let us know.
Give us your 2 cents.
About the status, non-status. Did we drop the ball on a particular issue? This is not the last time we'll visit this topic, so let us know what you guys think and what other aspects of the conversation that we missed that we can definitely pick up in for another conversation. Let us know what you think. You can contact us at sixcentsereport@gmail.com. If you're trying to contact me, it's Darnell Samuels on Facebook. And then on Twitter, on Instagram, it's Do Good Darnell, DOGUDDA_Darnell.
And I'm T-Joel N39 everywhere, and 6 Cents Report everywhere, or Facebook and Twitter. Let us know. And I'll definitely put a couple links in the show notes regarding property rights. Especially, there's a couple from Libertarian Christian Institute, which I found pretty good. And just in terms of talking through, how do we derive rights and some of the, different arguments that exist.
6 Cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?